The gates stand closed, rusted yet immovable. Behind them, lawns once immaculate now flicker with wild grass. Fountains that once marked precision and order sputter and choke with algae. A single window reflects the fading sun, and within that frame, a world of inherited power lies dormant. What survives of America's most guarded heirs is not the fortune itself, nor even the walls that enclosed it, but the absence that echoes through the corridors, a quiet testament to control, expectation, and discipline. Here, wealth was not leisure, it was architecture, ritual, and surveillance, shaping the lives of those born into it. In the distance, the hum of the city presses against this carefully constructed isolation. Yet within these bounds, time has moved differently. Rooms that once demanded obedience now demand nothing. Portraits stare blankly, furniture waits untouched, and the air carries the memory of decisions made silently, daily, by those entrusted not merely with property, but with a philosophy of permanence. This is a story of a legacy built on meticulous control and the relentless pressure of inheritance. The world outside measures success in accumulation, but within these walls, survival, reputation, and compliance were currencies far heavier. And now, stripped of purpose and vigilance, the estate itself seems to question its own reason for existing. The heir's legacy is not simply lost, it is fractured, hollowed, and endlessly observed, even in its silence. To understand what this place once demanded is to understand a particular kind of power, invisible, absolute, and unforgiving. Chapter 1. Rupture in the Present. The gates are closed, their iron lattices darkened by years of exposure. Every rivet polished once into authority, now dulled, reluctant witnesses to the absence within. Beyond them, the drive stretches straight, lined with elms that have lost the symmetry once enforced by gardeners and overseers. Each tree carries a quiet dissonance, uneven growth, limbs bending where care has faltered, shadows falling at odd angles. The estate's architecture asserts itself, but only in fragments. Stone steps are pocked with moss, balustrades are chipped, windows, once reflecting light to announce command, now mirror only the sky's indifference. There is a presence here, but it is of the residual sort, echoing orders, gestures, and inspections that no longer exist. The soundscape is muted. In the absence of engines, voices, and footsteps, the faint creak of wrought iron and the occasional rustle of birds form the estate's current rhythm. These are not signs of life, but of endurance, the building itself sustaining, resisting decay, while the human systems that gave it purpose have largely withdrawn. Within the walls, corridors stretch uninterrupted, lined with furniture whose placement once enforced protocol, now awaiting use that will not come. Even the air has memory. It hangs heavier in the rooms designed for deliberation, lighter in the spaces intended for leisure, reflecting a hierarchy that has outlasted its practitioners. Surveillance, once active and intrusive, is now passive. Cameras, sensors, and mechanical locks testify to an insistence on vigilance that persists only because the estate was built to require it. Each doorway, each corridor, each gated section was designed to remind those inside of their role, their obligation, and the ever-present weight of observation. Today, these mechanisms function without a subject. They are rituals of emptiness, maintaining a theater of control with no actors. The grounds are a study in frozen intention. Fountains, designed to punctuate corners with precise arcs of water, now drip erratically, their pumps struggling against sediment and time.
Paths that guided visitors along carefully choreographed sightlines are overrun with grass, signaling the lapse of supervision. Yet the geometry remains. It is a reminder that order can outlast occupancy, that the imprint of control can persist even in neglect. Even the lighting betrays a hierarchy of memory. Chandeliers hang over long halls, each crystal a prism catching what little sunlight enters. They were instruments of spectacle and influence, arranged to impress at every glance, every reflection calculated. Now they sway faintly, echoing the weight of decisions made long ago, decisions that shaped the rhythm of those who lived and worked within these walls. The estate does not scream for attention, it asserts it quietly, in the subtle insistence of design, resisting dissolution. Movement within the house is minimal, yet deliberate. Security personnel patrol with routines learned over decades, their presence a reminder that the estate's authority remains partially functional, though hollowed. Visitors, when allowed, experience the simultaneous magnetism and disquiet of a place defined as much by absence as presence. There is authority in the emptiness. The estate is still a measure of influence, a tangible residue of what once demanded obedience, attention, and compliance. The estate's inventory of objects further emphasizes this tension. Bookshelves sag with dust-laden tomes, many opened once and never revisited. Silver trays lie in neat stacks, polished only in memory of past oversight. Clocks tick mechanically, marking the passage of time without human engagement. Each object speaks of systems that governed every movement, every decision, yet now function independently, their purpose divorced from those who once animated it. Even the natural elements conspire in quiet testimony. Vines creep along facades, curling around columns that were never meant to be obscured. Winds whistle through empty courtyards, carrying with them a sense of interruption, of continuity breached. Water from rain collects unevenly in basins once designed for symmetry, and the resulting ponds mirror the irregularity of human absence.
Chapter 2. Cultural Significance. The estate's significance extends beyond its walls, beyond the careful geometry of its gardens and the symmetry of its facades. It exists as a node in a wider lattice of influence, a place where wealth, power, and cultural authority intersected in a language of design and ritual. Visitors once entered not merely to witness opulence, but to engage in a series of calculated social exchanges, each movement guided by custom and expectation. Architecture, art, and interior arrangement were instruments of persuasion. Every line of sight, every threshold communicated hierarchy, taste, and authority, dictating behavior as much as providing shelter. In this sense, the estate functioned as a cultural system, a vessel for ideas about refinement, legacy, and control. The rooms themselves were calibrated to signal discernment. Libraries displayed rare volumes, not only for study, but as markers of intellectual alignment. Portraits and tapestries encoded lineage, allegiances, and values, forming a visual language intelligible to those who moved within the social stratum it served. Even utilitarian spaces, pantries, service corridors, kitchens were constructed to maintain order and efficiency, reinforcing the estate's overarching logic. Staff, trained in specific patterns of movement and observation, acted as extensions of this architecture, ensuring that social codes were enacted without fail. In this way, the estate did not merely house culture, it performed it, and in its performance it defined what belonged to a sphere of influence and what did not. The grounds, too, were emblematic of status.
Gardens were laid out according to principles that combined aesthetic fashion with symbolic authority. Pathways and vistas controlled experience, allowing movement through the landscape to mirror the hierarchy within. Open lawns communicated space and command. Secluded groves suggested privacy and discretion. Each choice reinforced the idea that the estate itself was an instrument of taste and judgment, an environment in which culture was not passive but enforced through design. Objects within the house functioned as signifiers of a cultivated identity. Tableware, silver, and porcelain were chosen with precision. Their arrangement on tables or display cabinets expressed alignment with broader social standards. The estate's collection of art and antiques was not a personal indulgence, but a curated dialogue with peers and rivals. Value was encoded in rarity, provenance, and the ability to demonstrate continuity with accepted canons of taste. Through these objects, the estate communicated both permanence and aspiration, reminding observers that its influence was as much symbolic as it was material. Every ceremony or gathering reinforced this network of influence. Dinners, receptions, and smaller meetings were orchestrated with a meticulous attention to order: who entered first, who was seated where, how conversations were guided. The estate, in effect, was a stage on which social hierarchies were displayed and maintained. Its design ensured that participants understood their place without needing instruction. Authority was self-evident, embedded in the spatial arrangement, the objects present, and the ritualized behaviors demanded by the environment. Even absence reinforces significance. The estate's current emptiness highlights the precision and weight of its former cultural function. Where visitors once moved according to the dictates of taste and protocol, silence now holds the same geometry, as though the house itself recalls its own importance. The alignment of objects, the careful proportion of rooms, the flow of corridors, all continue to articulate the rules of social engagement long after the actors have departed. The cultural imprint persists in tangible form, measurable in the care with which the estate resists decay, and in the clarity with which its design communicates authority, even in stillness.
Chapter 3: Origins and Vision. The estate did not emerge spontaneously. Its foundations were deliberate, chosen not merely for geography, but for projection. The land itself carried promise, rolling topography that allowed views to be orchestrated, forests to frame approach roads, and watercourses to punctuate the landscape with reflective surfaces. Every acre was selected with foresight, anticipating not only the physical structures it would bear, but the cultural and ideological weight it would project. The vision was as much about dominance over environment as it was about accommodation of human needs, embedding authority into the very terrain. The architects, though anonymous to many who now traverse the property, were more than designers of buildings. They were interpreters of an ideology, the codification of wealth into habit, space, and behavior. Rooms were planned for observation and movement, for gathering and seclusion, and for the enactment of protocol that would govern daily life. Staircases, corridors, and thresholds were calibrated to enforce order. Even sight lines from windows, across lawns, or through aligned doorways were instruments of social control, ensuring that visitors and residents alike experienced hierarchy as an inescapable fact of spatial logic. Construction itself became a medium of intention. Materials were chosen for endurance and symbolic resonance. Stone quarried to signal permanence, wood selected to convey refinement, metals to suggest both security and prestige.
Laborers, craftsmen, and artisans were directed not merely to build, but to inscribe values into the estate. The rhythm of beams, the proportion of rooms, and the articulation of facades all communicated that this was a place designed to endure as an instrument of legacy. Gardens, courtyards, and auxiliary structures were not afterthoughts. They were extensions of the central ideology. Each hedge, fountain, and avenue was positioned to choreograph movement and perception. Pathways guided attention to vistas, courtyards provided pauses for reflection and control, and ornamental features marked points of social significance. The natural and the artificial were interwoven deliberately, creating a continuous environment in which the estate itself functioned as a mechanism for reinforcing hierarchy, taste, and influence. The early inhabitants, the first generation of heirs and stewards, were trained to inhabit the estate as a system. Daily routines were dictated not only by practical needs, but by a philosophy of discipline and observation. Even the simplest tasks were governed by protocol. Movement from one room to another, interactions with staff, and engagement with visitors followed implicit rules encoded in the design. In inhabiting the estate, the residents internalized its logic, becoming both subjects and agents of the environment's social order.
Chapter 4. The System at Work. The estate functioned as a self-contained organism, each wing and corridor integrated into a precise network of routines and obligations. Daily life was orchestrated with mechanical exactitude, the rhythm dictated as much by architecture as by the invisible hand of authority. Hallways were not merely passages, they were conduits through which staff and residents enacted a choreography of expectation. Doors opened and closed according to schedule. Rooms were entered and vacated in predetermined sequence. Even the timing of lighting and the circulation of air followed protocols designed to sustain both comfort and discipline. Every motion, observed or unseen, reinforced the estate's internal logic. Staff operated within layers of hierarchy that mirrored the estate's spatial organization. Housekeepers, butlers, and valets were trained in sequences of action that extended beyond simple service. Their movements maintained order, preserved appearances, and communicated authority indirectly. Instructions were often non-verbal, conveyed through positioning, timing, and the placement of objects. Meals were prepared and served according to scripts that dictated order of seating, timing of courses, and arrangement of tableware. Rituals as integral to the system as cleaning, maintenance, or the movement of goods from kitchens to storage. Even the smallest detail, a folded napkin or polished silver, reinforced a culture of precision and obedience. Financial structures ran in parallel with these human systems. Ledgers, accounts, and investments were monitored continuously, not only to preserve wealth, but to signal control. Money circulated internally and externally, sustaining operations and influencing perception. Payments to staff, procurement of materials, and the acquisition of art or furniture were all governed by the estate's embedded practices. Each transaction carried meaning, ensuring that economic activity supported the cultural and social hierarchies inscribed in the house. The estate's calendar was itself a mechanism of governance. Daily, weekly, and seasonal cycles dictated work patterns, maintenance schedules, and social functions. Cleaning, inspection, and preparation for visitors occurred on a relentless rotation, leaving no space for randomness or improvisation. Even leisure and private time for heirs or residents were subtly regulated, integrated into the system as intervals within the larger architecture of order.
The estate demanded conformity not only in what was done, but in when and how it was done. Communication, both explicit and implicit, reinforced the system. Written directives, verbal instructions, and tacit signals ensured that the estate's logic was continuously enacted. A shift in one department immediately rippled through others, creating a network in which every participant understood not only their own function, but the dependencies of those around them. In this way, the estate operated as a single, coordinated organism, where culture and hierarchy were inseparable from daily action, and authority was transmitted as much through procedure as through presence. Even minor disruptions were absorbed and corrected. A broken item, a late delivery, a delayed service, each was noted, adjusted for, and incorporated back into the system. Redundancy and discipline ensured continuity. The estate, in effect, was self-regulating. The design, combined with trained human agents, maintained function even under strain. Every corridor, staircase, and service area was both a conduit and a checkpoint, sustaining the order that underpinned the estate's authority.
Chapter 5. The Golden Age. At its zenith, the estate was more than a residence. It was a statement of power rendered in stone, glass, and cultivated land. From the main avenue, the approach conveyed authority without need of announcement. Lawns were uninterrupted plains of green, trimmed to precision, while fountains and reflecting pools punctuated the landscape with deliberate choreography. Visitors, arriving by carriage or automobile, experienced an environment calibrated to signal both the weight of inheritance and the command of presence. Authority was embedded in proportion and alignment. Nothing here was accidental, and the perception of order reinforced the reality of control. Inside, rooms vibrated with orchestrated activity. Servants, managers, and aides moved in patterns refined over decades, their routines perfected to the point of invisibility. Meals were not merely sustenance, but a performance, with courses timed to the cadence of conversation and movement. Even the smallest domestic operations, lighting candles, arranging silver, opening shutters, were executed in synchrony, reinforcing the rhythm of the estate itself. The residents, attuned to this system, navigated the house with a practiced awareness of how their presence intersected with both staff and space. Every gesture, every interaction was inscribed into the estate's broader narrative of order and refinement. Financially, the estate's resources were consolidated and expansive. Investments supported not only the house itself, but a network of influence extending beyond the grounds. Art, furnishings, and architectural embellishments were acquired with intent, reflecting both taste and the capacity to exert cultural authority. Money was never idle. It circulated through construction, patronage, and procurement, creating a visible manifestation of permanence. Visitors recognized this circulation, perceiving wealth not as a static figure, but as an active force, measured in both substance and spectacle. The estate's social calendar reinforced its internal hierarchy while projecting outward influence. Dinners, receptions, and gatherings were executed with precise formality. Each attendee's position reinforced rank and expectation. Even seemingly informal encounters were structured by spatial cues and ritualized movement. In every hall and parlor, the environment itself dictated behavior, ensuring that influence radiated from the house in patterns as exact as those governing life within its walls. Architecture and landscape merged seamlessly to communicate both invitation and restraint.
Gardens framed courtyards, offering vistas that both welcomed and disciplined the gaze. Staircases and corridors directed attention, organizing circulation so that no movement was unmediated. Interiors were adorned with objects of deliberate resonance. Sculptures, paintings, and furniture were placed to signify taste, lineage, and authority. The estate was not merely inhabited, it was performed. Its order was absolute, extending from the smallest domestic detail to the overarching experience of arrival, occupancy, and observation.
Chapter 6. Entering Pressure. The estate, once a closed ecosystem of precision and authority, began to register strains that the architecture and routines alone could not absorb. Subtle shifts appeared first in the corridors, in the hesitations of staff whose movements had been honed to exact repetition. Orders arrived with slight delay, rooms were polished, yet lacking the uniform exactness of prior decades. These were small disruptions, almost imperceptible, yet indicative of deeper currents. The estate's systems were designed for continuity, not adaptation, and when expectations of control collided with unforeseen pressures, the cracks became visible. Internal tension emerged around the distribution of inheritance. The framework that had maintained hierarchy within the household now extended outward into the family itself. Decisions over succession, previously ceremonial and guided by protocol, began to fracture under conflicting interests. The estate's architecture, in effect, could not reconcile disputes between heirs or arbitrate ambiguities in authority. Family members, accustomed to the discipline of the house and the clarity of its internal logic, now encountered negotiation, delay, and uncertainty. These personal disagreements reverberated through staff routines and management structures, subtly altering the cadence of operation. Societal change exerted an equally insistent pressure. Cultural shifts outside the estate challenged assumptions that had long gone unexamined. Staff recruitment, maintenance practices, and social interactions now had to adapt, however incrementally, to labor expectations, new regulations, and shifting norms of behavior. Tasks once implicit in hierarchy now demanded explicit negotiation or compliance with codified rules. Even the language of protocol, once fixed, required adjustment as assumptions of obedience and availability were tested by both external oversight and the evolving workforce. Financial strain was both a symptom and a vector of tension. Investments that had once yielded predictable returns became less reliable. Maintenance budgets tightened, commissions for art and renovation slowed, and resources that had supported a culture of abundance were rationed. Wealth, which had previously been performative, began to draw attention in ways the estate had not anticipated. Decisions about expenditure, preservation, and acquisition became fraught, revealing the fragility underlying apparent permanence. The estate's spatial and procedural rigidity compounded these pressures. Long corridors and segmented wings, once instruments of order, now amplified delays. Coordination of staff, communication between departments, and movement of goods all encountered friction. The architecture, designed to enforce discipline, resisted improvisation. Adaptations required care and negotiation, but the physical layout and ingrained routines were resistant to sudden change. In effect, the estate itself became a test of the limits of its own ideology. Even subtle environmental signals reflected tension. Gardens grew less symmetrical, fountains faltered as maintenance cycles slipped. In the main halls,
Furniture and fixtures were maintained, but less frequently realigned, revealing the gradual erosion of vigilance. The estate's aesthetic and operational cohesion, long a marker of absolute control, began to register the cumulative weight of internal and external stress. Staff behavior mirrored these pressures. Long-trained employees, once moving in near-mechanical synchrony, now hesitated, questioned, or deferred decisions. Training alone could not resolve contradictions arising from resource scarcity, conflicting instructions from heirs, or the intrusion of external regulation. The system relied on clarity and predictability, and when these were compromised, the estate's internal culture shifted imperceptibly, signaling the onset of systemic strain.
Chapter 7. Decline and Hollowing. The estate's surfaces remained intact, but the logic that had sustained them began to unravel. Where once corridors directed movement and staff executed precise routines, gaps appeared. Delays in cleaning, unfinished maintenance, and absent oversight. The systems that had enforced order now operated only partially, and the estate's authority, once tangible in every gesture and object, was gradually diluted. The hierarchy, once unquestioned, faltered as key positions went unfilled or were rotated with insufficient experience, leaving operations vulnerable to error. Financial pressures accelerated the hollowing. Resources were extracted with greater frequency, applied less judiciously, and increasingly diverted from preservation to short-term needs. Maintenance, once a ritualized priority, became sporadic. Artworks, furniture, and architectural details, symbols of permanence and taste, were sold, moved, or left to decay. The estate's cultural currency, once immovable, began to bleed outward, measured not by the accumulation of wealth, but by the erosion of its physical and symbolic structures. Each object removed or neglected altered the balance, undermining the cohesion that had defined the estate's function for decades. Staff routines, carefully codified over generations, lost their coherence. Roles that had demanded training, discipline, and oversight were compressed or eliminated. Remaining personnel became overextended, their adherence to protocol inconsistent, their capacity to enforce order diminished. Even minor tasks that once reflected the estate's insistence on perfection, polishing silver, arranging books, maintaining garden symmetry, now became indicators of absence rather than precision. The estate's internal rhythms, once synchronized with the lives of its inhabitants, began to oscillate irregularly, revealing the fragility beneath its imposing exterior. Physical structures, though resilient, bore the marks of neglect. Fountains clogged, stone steps cracked, and woodwork weathered without consistent care. Gardens, once emblematic of the estate's ideological control, grew uneven, paths shifting as shrubs encroached and trees expanded beyond their intended borders. These slow transformations were not dramatic but cumulative, silently signaling the breakdown of systems designed to perpetuate authority. Even architecture, which had been the most enduring medium of control, became a participant in the decline, its deliberate proportions and alignments gradually eroded by inattention. Decision-making fractured alongside structural decay. Where stewardship had once been centralized, responsibility dispersed unevenly. Minor choices, once trivial, now carried disproportionate consequences. When a repair was deferred or a resource misallocated, the ripple extended through multiple departments. The estate's integrated systems, which had depended on coordinated enforcement, were now vulnerable to minor lapses, each one amplifying the erosion of authority. Symbolic weight of absence grew alongside tangible decline.
Empty rooms and unused wings, once maintained for ritual or prestige, became reminders of what the estate demanded but could no longer enforce. Spaces intended to reflect control now reflected vacancy. Silence replaced oversight. The estate retained the appearance of function, but the mechanisms of enforcement, observation, and cultivation, the invisible architecture of compliance, had weakened.
Chapter 8. Aftermath. The estate endures, though its authority has receded. Hallways remain intact, corridors stretch uninterrupted, yet the activity that once filled them has dissipated. Windows continue to reflect light with the precision of design, but behind each pane lies absence. The physical structures, stone facades, timbered beams, and wrought iron, retain their presence, resistant to the passage of time. They are monuments to a system that once dictated rhythm and order, yet now they operate largely in silence, markers of former command rather than instruments of it. Objects persist as traces of intention. Furniture occupies the spaces it was assigned, but without the protocols to animate it. Silver, porcelain, and glass remain arranged in static order, suggesting the discipline of caretakers long departed. Bookshelves continue to display volumes selected for authority, lineage, and taste, but no one reads them with the scrutiny their placement once implied. Even the gardens, though partially maintained, display remnants of deliberate planning. Axial pathways, trimmed hedges, and sculpted vistas offer a memory of the ideological control once exercised over both space and perception. These fragments, though inert, communicate the framework of hierarchy and aesthetic judgment that shaped every aspect of the estate. Staff, where retained, operate at reduced capacity. The intricate choreography of daily life, once inseparable from the estate's function, has contracted into essential routines. Cleaning, minimal maintenance, and security patrols sustain the superficial appearance of order, but the deeper cultural and social systems no longer operate. The estate exists in a state of functional suspension, a skeleton of its former operational complexity, upheld by a fraction of the personnel required for its golden age. Economic remnants continued to define influence, though in altered form. Endowments, investments, or property rights tied to the estate persist, providing a residual capacity to shape decisions within a limited sphere. These tangible markers of power are supplemented by intangible presence, the knowledge that this property, once an absolute authority in social and cultural hierarchies, still commands recognition, even if enforcement is diminished. Visitors, heirs, or distant observers perceive the weight of history in the very proportions and arrangements of the estate. Chapter 9. Legacy and Question. The estate stands as both presence and absence, a material memory of influence now dispersed. Its facades, carefully proportioned and meticulously preserved in places, bear witness to the ambitions that once shaped them. Yet these same surfaces, silent and still, indicate what cannot be retrieved: the orchestration of movement, the cadence of protocol, the subtle enforcement of hierarchy. Visitors may observe symmetry, admire gardens, or note the persistence of certain collections, but the estate's authority, once enacted continuously through people, ritual, and design, has dissipated. What remains is a trace, a structural echo of an ideology no longer operational. Cultural memory persists unevenly, threaded through objects and spaces that survived extraction and neglect.
Portraits, rare volumes, and architectural flourishes retain a capacity to communicate status and refinement, even when the systems that gave them meaning are absent. Each element functions as a cipher. It invites interpretation, but only a partial one. Without the continuous enactment of the estate's routines and the presence of staff and heirs to enforce its logic, the symbols remain intact but inert. Their significance is legible to an observer, yet the force they once projected has diminished. The tangible legacy is mirrored by the intangible, stories, recollections, and documented histories that trace the estate's influence across families, local communities, and broader cultural networks. These accounts preserve knowledge of hierarchy, taste, and authority, yet they also underscore fragility. Memory is selective, emphasizing grandeur and oversight while eliding failure, strain, or decay. In this way, the estate's narrative becomes a negotiation between what endures materially and what persists only in perception, a duality that shapes how power and culture are remembered and understood. Even as fragments of wealth and art survive, they exist alongside the absence of the full system that once integrated them. The house, the grounds, and the objects are no longer coordinated into a single self-enforcing structure. Their survival depends upon external intervention, maintenance, curation, or stewardship by those removed from the original ideology. In this disjunction, the estate becomes an object lesson. Permanence is never inherent to design or materiality alone, but contingent upon the continuous practice of authority. The legacy also poses questions about influence beyond the estate itself. How do systems of wealth, taste, and hierarchy translate into the broader cultural fabric when their physical and social mechanisms are disrupted? The estate, even in its diminished state, continues to shape perception. It demonstrates what authority looked like, how it was maintained, and what happens when the structures that enforce it are weakened. Observers perceive not only what remains, but what was lost, the coordination, discipline, and control that had defined the experience of the estate and its residents.